Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me, and I'm really grateful that you've made a bit of time. We're recording this during lunchtime, so really grateful that you're here with me today. I want to make this as interactive as possible, so would love to have your questions in the chat and any comments that you've got. But I'll introduce myself, and then we can get into this. Tēnā koutou katoa. Anea ngati Noe, ngati Horana, ngati Panama, ngati Ingarahi, ngati Iwiwi, ngati America e mihi kau ana ki koto. I whānau mai au ki America, ko te tai te manga e ru nei toku nakau. Ko Waitaki te awa e mahia aku ma harahara. Ko Otatahi toku kainga e noho nei au, e mihi ka tika ki na mana whenua. Ko tangata tiriti aho, e roia taku tunga mahi o Perryfield Lawyers, ko Stephen mo taku ingoa, no reira ngā mihi kia koto katoa. Yeah, it's great to have so many of you here, and I'm really looking forward to this session. Been working on this paper for quite a while, so I'm grateful for the chance to share it with you. And I thought what I'd do is keep it very informal. I thought it would be good to just outline some of the background to why this paper was written, but then I would love to dive into a bit of interactive discussion. You can put your questions in the chat and I'll see those, but also if you want to a bit later, you're welcome to come off of mute and have a discussion or a comment or a chat. I'm also really lucky that somebody's joined us who's Matthew Jackson from Elementary Systems. So thank you for joining Matthew. He's going to share a little bit of his journey and a different perspective than I can bring to talking about nature as shareholder. Maybe talk a little bit about some of what they've been going through, maybe some challenges. What I want for this time together to be is maybe changing paradigms of thought and maybe challenging the ways that you've thought about shareholders and nature. So thank you for joining me. I'm going to begin. I gave my little pepeha where I'm from, but I'd like to start with a karakia. And I love this karakia during the winter time, and you'll see why when I read the translation. Whakataka te hao ki te uru, whakataka te hao ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti he Maori ora. And I'm down here in Ototahi in Christchurch, and the reason I say it's appropriate is this is the translation. Get ready for the westerly and be prepared for the southerly. It will be icy cold inland and icy cold on the shore. May the dawn rise red-tipped on ice, on snow, on frost, a glorious day. And fortunately, that's what it is today. If I look out the window, it's a nice and sunny, but there was some frost in, on the windscreen when I got out to come into work today. So, nature as shareholder, I'm assuming that everybody has a copy and you hopefully have read it, maybe skim read it. I wanted to acknowledge at the start that there's a whole bunch of names. I don't know if you skipped over them, but a whole bunch of supporters in the mid-20s of supporters. These are all organizations that I approached, and I think we basically have similar aligned values. So if you're not familiar with these groups, I'd suggest you go have a look at their websites. They're doing, each one of them I know is doing amazing things. And I either have met them through panels or, conversations, or I'm actually supporting with legal type things. So make sure you have a look at what they're doing because, yeah, they're all doing amazing things. And I also wanted to do a shout out to Lily Duval, who's the painter, the watercolor artist who gave me all these amazing images. I paid her so that we could get some really nice artwork in this paper. And maybe this may be a side note, but legal documents have a tendency to be a bit boring and dry. So it was a very deliberate strategy to think, how can I make this more full of life than look at this, document and read it and the words only. I really wanted it to be visual and I wanted it to come like just some of these images. They're just so beautiful, like that image of the moth. And I wanted it to remind us as we're reading the paper of the beauty of nature itself. So that was the reason why all the images are in there. And I guess one of my challenges is when you're working on things and you're working on papers, what would it look like to bring in some visual elements and make it interesting, and have some nature included in the documents that you're writing? I don't know what that would be, annual reports, maybe memos, but why don't we get a bit more creative and try to bring in other influences so that we can do things that are more visually interesting as well. So, the brief background, I think I've met several of you on the call, but I haven't met everybody. So, just briefly, my American accent, it was always confusing to people, but I moved to New Zealand to Aotearoa back when I was 7 years old. So, I actually grew up down in Otago in a place called Papakaio, right off of the Waitaki River. It's a blink and you miss it type of place. But the reason I mention this is that I was grounded within this system of thought, this way of being. This was the 1980s, and I moved to Christchurch to Otautahi in the late 1980s, went to high school here, went to Canterbury University, got my law degree. I did a history degree and a politics degree as well as law. Then I moved to Wellington and I worked for 3 years at Russell McVeigh, a really big law firm. And then I worked offshore in London, Tokyo, and Sydney at an international law firm, and then came back 10 years ago. And the reason I mention this is that I put this little, I debated a long time about what I should say, but I don't want to call it a disclaimer, but I did put something at the front, just acknowledging that we each come to these conversations with ways of thinking and ways of being. So I called it a cautionary note under part 2, challenges and opportunities. I'm not going to read it all out, but the challenging part of this is to remember that each of us brings ways of thinking and paradigms of thought to conversations like this. So if you were like me and you grew up and went to high school or university in New Zealand, there were probably influences on us that we didn't even know, that was there. And I think it's important to recognize that that way of thinking is something that we need to challenge and need to always be willing to learn. So my journey, having worked in the big, giant international law firms and New Zealand's biggest law firm at the time, and my way of thinking was quite different early in my life compared to my way of thinking today. And I give this example of the Milton Friedman approach, shareholder primacy. How much money can we make from this business? As opposed to the Lorax approach, who speaks for the trees? How can we build in nature as a consideration when we're running our businesses? And I just want to acknowledge that that's been a journey for me to move from probably more the Milton Friedman side of things to more probably friends with the Lorax. So each of you listening, you might be going through moves and shifts as well. And my hope is that this paper would be part of that, that there would be some challenges in it that you would grapple with and wrestle with. Um, we aren't the people that we will be in 10 years' time. You are becoming someone that you are going to be different. There's a growth, there's a change which happens. So be aware of that. This is not just about this paper, this is just generally in life, right? We are becoming someone. Who is that person going to be? And what are the influences that are shaping who that person is becoming? So, as a side example, if you meet someone who speaks another language and you're like, wow, they speak French, or they speak Te Reo Maori, or they speak whatever, you could do it too. You could learn languages. You could become the type of person that speaks more than one language. So, in relation to this paper, the challenge is what is your paradigm of thought when it comes to thinking about nature and its role in a corporate environment? And what might it look like if you were to challenge those assumptions? Traditionally, shareholding and shareholders have come out of this idea of money. Often comes back to money, doesn't it? Profits. How do I distribute the money? Who is it that benefits from this endeavor? But it doesn't have to be that way. We made up companies. They're a fictional thing. If we could get in a time machine and go back, a couple hundred years, there was no such thing as a company in the way that we think of them today. So if we made them up, go back to 1750, there was no shareholders and directors in the way that we talk about it. I get encouraged by that because it also means that we can reinvent what they are for the future. We could actually do things differently. So the main paradigm that I want to challenge with the paper was this idea of what does it mean for directors, shareholders, companies to build in the idea of nature and the idea that we need to be thinking about nature as we're making decisions around the boardroom table. And really, here in this beautiful country in Aotearoa, we've been given three examples, actually, of this idea of nature having a personhood or a legal being. So that's the Wanganui River, the Taranaki Maunga, or mountain, and the Te Urewera forest. So those, as part of treaty settlements, have been granted legal personhood, which means that in theory, they could own shares, they could own companies. And so that's what really inspired this paper. It inspired the thinking about it. I wrote another paper if with two amazing co-authors, David Jefferson, Elizabeth McPherson. That one is exploring what would it mean for governance if nature is the owner of a company. In the paper at the back, there's links to that and descriptions of that. So if I get time later, I'll put it in the chat, but it's pretty easy to find. It's in that paper. But with this paper, what I wanted to challenge was thinking about some of the complexities around, well, what would it look like if we had nature as a shareholder? So that could be done with this sort of statutory approach, which is the government itself has recognized nature. The government has said this mountain exists as a legal person. So that's an option now. That would be something that would be possible. But the other way is that as private citizens, as people, or as shareholders of a company, we could start to implement this. We could set up entities which have nature at their core. So the model that I talk about in the paper is using a charitable trust structure. Charitable trusts are relatively well understood. They have easy to understand governance, and they often will look in the name trust. People trust them. So a charitable trust is a model where you could have in its purposes advancing the promotion of a particular region or a particular species or a particular place. Like the limits are kind of down to our imagination in terms of what you could actually do with a charitable trust. So, as an example, you could set up a charitable trust which was for a particular bioregion. So, it's there to enhance and improve native plants and fauna and flora within a particular bioregion. That could actually get charitable status, which would mean it had a better tax position, but it would also mean that that entity would represent a part of nature. This is where it gets challenging because what what qualifies? What should be the criteria? So one of the case studies I put in the paper is this amazing group in Takaka. Some of you may be associated with it on the call, with the Takaka Co-housing Project. So if you ever get a chance, you should go visit amazing tiny homes in a community area. And the key is that you park your car outside and you walk into it. So it's all next door to each other. There's community, there's shared communal gardens, picnic areas, barbecue areas, shared spaces. But the way we set that up was that there's a charitable trust, which is about improving this ex-dairy farm, planting education, raising awareness, about the nature aspects of that particular piece of land. So in a way, we haven't maybe overtly said it in that trust deed, but it is representing nature to some extent. And then that trust then owns a development company, and that development company is the one that has developed the land and built the houses and got the consents and sold them. So I think there was about 32 homes in the first stage, and then they're looking to build the second stage and then eventually a third stage. So the point of this is that if some of you are curious and you wanted to actually put this into place, you could set up an entity which was separate to a company and which could be issued shares, and those shares could then represent nature, at least in some way. Um, the way that I think it could work practically is that the company could have a class of shares, which might be called the Kaitiaki shares or the Guardian shares, and those shares could then be owned by that charitable trust. And the implication of that could be that, for example, before directors are appointed to this company, the approval of this charitable trust is required. Before you change the purposes of the company, the approval of this charitable trust is required. And so the trustees of that trust would be representing nature. And when they come to the boardroom table, they would need to bring their perspective as the shareholder, representing nature, which is the purpose of that entity. So I think it would change the conversation, definitely change the tone of the conversation if you came to important decisions and you looked to the person who represents nature and said, "Well, what what do you think? What does the river think? What does the mountain think? What does the bioregion think?" So that's how I can see how it might practically work out. Because I didn't want to keep this paper just at the theoretical, like here's some concepts and ideas. I actually think you could do it today. You could implement this today, if you chose to do it. The dangers that I see, and advance warning to Matthew, I might get you to jump in a few minutes because I think it'd be good if people could understand some of the challenges and hear another voice in this conversation. But also, I'd love to hear any of your questions. So I've been talking a bit in the chat. Please put it after Matthew's spoken. We might turn to some of you because you might have wisdom to share as well. But one of the challenges that I faced when I've been thinking about this is I mentioned before our upbringings. What is it that we think our paradigms of thought? Originally, I thought, oh, great. Well, we'll just have, Papatuanuku, Mother Earth. Let's set up a trust that represents Papatuanuku. That's the translation of Mother Earth into Te Reo. That's a great name. Or, let's pick another name if we want it to be about the ocean or about the sky, or let's bring in these translated terms from Te Reo Maori and Te Ao Maori. But what I've realized since is that this is a very simplistic and ongoing colonization approach. So I don't recommend it because what you're doing, if you approach it that way, is that you're taking your Western mindset potentially and saying, well, I watched Captain Planet back in the 90s. There was Mother Earth, Gaia, Mother Earth. That seems like a good concept. I want to represent Mother Earth. Who wouldn't want Mother Earth? Well, let's call it Papatuanuku. But what you're missing by doing that is that there's a whole cosmology around that perspective from Te Ao Maori. So I think it's a really big danger if we come in with a Western perspective and say, well, we're just going to take that term and use it for the purposes that we want to. So please don't go off and start setting up trusts and bringing in terms or concepts that we may not fully understand. I've been really fortunate to have a number of friends who are wise heads when it comes to Te Ao Maori. I'm on my own Te Reo journey trying to learn. So I've been able to speak with my teachers. I've been able to speak with Jan Hania, who's very respected in this area as well. And he gave me thoughts to try to feed into this paper as well. So yeah, my encouragement is don't just rush off and set something up without fully understanding what it is that you're doing, or how you approach it. Um, in the paper, I tried to build in more on this. I'm not going to go into all of that, um, but I did put in some examples of how might this be done. So I put in the Wairua Kohu Charitable Trust. So a shout out to Manu Kadi. He spoke at the Nature Symposium from the Sustainable Business Network recently, and he generously put up the paper as a slide with a QR code and everything. So we had a whole bunch of downloads from that. And some of you here may have heard about it from that. So thank you to Manu. But in the paper, we go into what they're doing, recognizing a taonga species, which is fascinating. So that's really worth checking out. Generous Ventures is the other organization that's in the as a case study. They're looking at steward ownership. So what would it look like if shares are owned by a steward, and how that might play out? And then the Takaka co-housing project is in there as well. But what I didn't put in the paper, I did put a link in the resources to elementary systems. I didn't put the full background of two amazing guys who've been challenging in my thought process, Matthew and Harman, who are the co-founders of elementary systems. And Matthew and I caught up after the paper came out, and he said, "Oh, it's fine. You can put stuff in about us." So we'll do that at maybe part two. But Matthew, I asked, since you're joining the call and you're here, do you mind giving us a little bit of perspective from, because I've been talking a little bit of the theory and how you might play this out. What are some of your observations as somebody who's been wrestling with this, and we've been wrestling together with it, but what are some of the challenges? What are some things and perspectives that you can bring that maybe I didn't touch on or you'd like to highlight? I'll just hand it over to you.
So, thanks, Stephen. Ko Matthew Jackson toku ingoa I waihara keke i te waipunamu o Aotearoa. I think it's important to start, as you said, with the ways of thinking. Some of you on the call will know me, but my background is from elementary systems. Unconventional gold is an emissions reduction business focused on methane reduction, clean water, clean energy, and waste diversion. And we recognized that environmental integrity was fundamental to avoid greenwashing, and we're looking at the science-based targets. And I met Stephen through the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, where it led us to explore how nature could have a formal voice in our governance structure. And we started working with Stephen with some funding from Akina to look at what did it mean to be in commitment to Te working with the likes of Reggie. Some of the fellows were involved in a concept called I am the river is me. We've had guidance from the likes of Huya Lambi, and I have a background in process philosophy. And all of this led us, and these ways of thinking led us to ask that fundamental question: how does a company or a tauiwi company have a korero with nature? And from there, it actually got deeper into how do we actually ensure authentic Indigenous representation and environmental decisions. But at its core, with Stephen, what we decided to do was create the trust and give the trust the voices of water, energy, and soil, allocate and explain the worldview and how we would measure that based on the science-based targets. So, so that's kind of the, I guess, the way of thinking and where that came from. Now, what we tested and what we learned. Well, fundamentally, only mana whenua could have a true korero with the mountain for a place-based decision making. When we presented the model to iwi, it would be obvious. Of course, you have a company and a trust, but an iwi would often have a single value system, whereas we work in five distinct different value systems as an infrastructure company working in Arohi with stakeholders running the technology with supply chain. And at the same time, the SBTI and iwi views don't always overlap. Sometimes they align and sometimes they don't align. So there's you have to consider cultural authenticity in the decision making. We received overwhelmingly positive feedback from stakeholders and workshops and impact community. I was invited to lecture at Stanford about regenerative economics. I was privileged to have time with Dr. Taina Boser-Dean, the inventor of the donut economic model from an indigenous perspective, or the co-inventor, and she said that the model itself enhanced life spirit or Māori. And we were in deep discussions with the US Law Center and Grant Wilson about how this could be adopted at an international level. We engaged investors. That's when we got the feedback that even impact investors found the structure too complex and questions the control mechanisms. Who are the trustees? What are the voices? Who do they represent? And who are the real kaitiaki of the rohi? What role do they play? And maintaining respect for Te Tiriti. And I think you know, Stephen talked about this, and Haman and I debated this constantly, which is we can't use and take mataranga. The definition of tikanga varies in the rohis and across the whenua, and it's really important that we actually are clear on what its understanding was. So our assumptions were that it would move beyond tokenistic consultation to a genuine representation of Earth as a stakeholder in our project, give us market differentiation, integrity for science-based targets, show innovation and leadership, and help us identify aligned capital. But the reality of it was that investors saw it was complex. They struggled to understand where the clear or what the control structures were. The untested nature of the framework created complications during due diligence and operational uncertainty. And even testing it in multiple markets, there was a real lack of understanding of how it could exist in multiple markets and in broader investment contexts in other countries. So it really meant that there was a fear to shift from the idea of ownership to guardianship. Um, so what we did based on that was that we simplified the structure and made it clear that all stakeholders had to uphold the voice of nature. We embedded it directly into the company constitution. It means that all directors became responsible for upholding nature as a stakeholder with representation. And we're still testing this. We actually haven't had investors go into a significant level of due diligence on this new constitutional approach yet, but we're really positive about it. That simplified structure from feedback means that we expect that we won't have as many challenging barriers, but we can still uphold the value system that we've got. So the key takeaways: there's still significant structural barriers in the traditional investment frameworks. Um, the cultural authenticity and indigenous representation were fundamental. I believe there's market appetite for it, but we're still in a place where investment partners quite aren't ready to take these risks in these new regenerative economic models. But ultimately, Haman and I are still committed to this. And while we may not do it now, it's something we're committed to in the future. So I guess my final ask is if you are in that space, I will share a link and please reach out to me if you're interested in talking about this further.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think it just helps ground, what I was saying and what the paper says to actually hear from people, because it's challenging. It's even one idea to say, well, who could argue against nature having a voice? But then when you go out to get investors, are investors going to put money into this? And you need money to be able to make the idea go. And maybe
Mm,
it's about creating a new class of investors who have an understanding that's different to the old ways. I often use this as a frame of reference for what I'm working on because there's lots of different potential projects to work on, and I chose to write about this one. But one of the reasons was I like to think 100 years from now. You know, it's 2125. Unfortunately, unless you all have amazing health regimes, none of us are here. And, it's a paradigm shift of thinking to be imagining what will it be like in the future. But I would hope that people might look back at this type of a paper or this sort of a discussion and say, look at the beginnings, the nascent discussions about the role of nature from a legal perspective. Look at what they were talking about back in 2025 and look at what we now recognize. Like I think at some point there will be a question about the social license to operate if businesses are damaging the environment. Like if that's your modus operandi, if that's the way your business runs, at some point, I think it's not going to be acceptable. And equally, when it comes to health, for example, if there's a company that takes pure, beautiful, clean water, injects it with chemicals, sugars, and other ingredients, and then our children get addicted, is that going to be acceptable in the future? So it's fascinating. I reckon this is my take is that in 100 years we will not be the same as we are today. The same way that 100 years ago, if we had looked at business in 1925, it probably operated quite differently to today. So it's evolving, and we can be part of that evolution. So, thank you so much, Matthew. Really appreciate it. And what I'll do, there will be a follow-up email to this, and I'll put a link to your website and anything you want to send me, and we can make sure that people get resourced. Because
Yeah, Stephen, I'll add that because we always said that this work we wanted to be open sourced. So I think if we can actually share the original trust deed in a way that would be useful for people to see the depth of how we were thinking about it, I'd be open to doing that, even though it's not the one that we're utilizing.
yep, yeah, sure, yeah. Well, that's the beauty is it's your trust deed. I helped you pull it together, but yeah, definitely. The 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 one qualification I would say is don't copy paste stuff from what other people have done. You need to actually think about things yourself, go on a journey yourself. And quite often there will be specific situations of what it would look like in my context or what it would look like over here. I think, Deborah, you've put a question or you've put a statement about how you're involved in the health, public health, primary health care, so obviously you need to approach these things from the particular context, but I'm sure you all know that, but I'll just throw that in. Don't just I had a client who copy pasted something. They used Google and they found something that they thought was going to be appropriate, but it was an Australian document and it talked about the governing law of Australia and the process to amend it is you have to go to this member of parliament of this place in the state of Victoria. Totally inappropriate. Just it was an awful document. We basically had to tell them you need to start over. So just be careful of that. So what we might do is turn to the chat and see if there's any questions that will spark discussion. But equally, if you would like to share something, then I'm really happy. If you want to, then raise your hand, using the function, and then I'm happy if you want to say something. This is just meant to be as interactive as we can. One ask so that I don't forget it is this paper it took more than a year to write. I know it's not like 1,000 pages, but it's harder to write shorter than it is to write longer. Um, and I wanted to shout out Sustainable Business Network because they had an event recently, which was my reason for getting it out. But it was a lot of work, and I don't stand to directly benefit in any way in the sense of I just want the ideas to get out. So, would you join me in helping to spread information about it? For example, if your networks would benefit, it's pretty simple to go. It would probably take you 30 seconds to get the link, put it on LinkedIn, and say, hey, here's an interesting read. Or even better, my takeaways were one, two, three, because you know people I don't know, right? And I also made it an audio version of Seed's podcast. So I think it's episode 300 and no, 455. So there's an audio version if people are driving and. So the point is, would you help me, please, as ambassadors for these concepts to get the word out? If you send a newsletter out, could you add it as one line saying, here's an interesting paper, you might be interested in it? So that's my ask when it comes to spreading the word. Or when you get the follow-up email, hit forward and let somebody know about it. I think it's a great paper to stimulate discussion. It might be something you want to send to boards that you know of and then say, hey, let's have a discussion at our next boardroom. What would it look like in our context to try to give some representation to nature? And maybe it's as simple as saying that empty chair, that's we're going to keep it empty when we're making decisions and we're going to turn and say, what would nature think here? So, yeah. All right, so going back up into the chat, and Yeah, so Deborah, you've said, I'm interested in primary healthcare and public health. Anyone working in this area on the session today? Well, if there is, they can reach out to you. If anybody wants to contact me, I'll have your email and things so I can connect you, but feel free to get that discussion going. Rachel said, loving the ideas about how to have nature as a shareholder. Would a partnership with an existing charitable trust or incorporated society designed to protect the environment be another option? Perhaps the voice of people doing the mahi around a corporate governance table might be another option. Yeah, totally. I think that's right. And I think that's part of, thank you for raising it, because I think that there's many creative ways that you could approach this. For example, if you are a shareholder of a company or if you own a company or you're director, maybe you could approach a local environmental group and say, we'd like to come alongside and support what you're doing. We love the reforestation project that you've got going. How can we get involved? And would you have a representative who could come and speak to our board about what you do and the perspective that nature might have on our decision making? Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Roz said here, how would this work against some of the horrendous changes current politicians are pushing through? For example, mining in park areas, sea bottom trawling, open cast mines, oil drilling. Yeah, I mean, this is part of the thing is I I hope that these are aberrations and that there is an overall move away from that type of decision. But maybe this is about raising awareness about these issues and doing it in a really concrete way. I don't know if you know this, but there are 735,000 companies in New Zealand. I know because I asked Companies Office, because they're going to be doing some reforms of the Companies Act, and I was curious how many there were. That's a lot of companies. It's basically one in every five people, approximately, like one in every five or six people. So if more entities were having nature in mind, I think it would start to change some of the culture and it would change the way that we do things. So, yeah, no easy answer there apart from letting people know what you think. Um, yeah. All right. And then, Alan, you've responded. Keep any other questions coming, and we can turn to those as well. My view is that just as Parliament recognized legal personhood three times, one possibility might be for individual hapu or iwi to get direct High Court declarations that this feature has legal personhood, which could be represented and perhaps injured. Yeah, great thinking. It's not been done before. That's part of the purpose of this paper is to say, what would it look like? How could we do this? And Adrian, thank you. Great to see you on this. Thanks for all the work that you're doing out in the world. You sent me a presentation for LegalWise that looks at the construct of companies and fiduciary duties of directors. Great. Thank you. Well, if you're willing for it to be shared, I'm happy to add it as in the follow-up email. So thank you very much. And then we've got, is it Elisapesi? Thank you. Tanako Stephen, riveting talk. Love the innovative essence of your talk. A quick question. Is the Aotearoa NZ you mentioned to Ao Māori the concept and thinking behind an Indigenous Māori word? Please unpack the Western approach using Indigenous concepts. That's great comment. Yeah, in the Aotearoa New Zealand you mentioned to Ao Māori. Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is part, I'll be honest, this is part of my caution is that I don't want to try to unpack everything because I know I'll get it wrong. I'm humble enough to know that I'm humble to know what I don't know, So I think it's important that we don't try to the paper I purposefully didn't try to unpack Papatuanuku and Te Ao Māori because I recognized that that wasn't my lane. My purpose was to approach it from this sort of Western paradigm and say, well, legally, what's possible? But that's why I put in that cautionary note as well. Because I do have a caution, which is, I think I said in the paper, we're like ants running around, thinking that we're so self-important. The mountain's going to be there in 100,000 years, like our lifetimes are sneezes, if anything. So how do we do this? I'm trying to be proactive and constructive. Is it the right way? Honestly, I'm not sure. There's some actual deep theological questions, not to get too philosophical here, but what is the role of humanity or humans in the context of nature. Like, are we outworkings of nature itself? Are we above nature? Are we meant to, is steward the right word? Steward implies that we somehow know what's the right thing to do. Like, we're stewards of something, we're taking care of it. But is that the right conception? I'm deliberately being provocative here to show you that these are questions we need to grapple with and wrestle with and understand. And I don't have all the answers. Brian, thanks for your comment. I'd be curious to hear thoughts on how to represent the interests of nature. Does that seat on the board, for example, get filled by a local person with a historic connection to the natural feature or by an expert ecologist? This may introduce a risk of leaning heavily on that Western lens you mentioned earlier. That's a great point. I guess my first reaction is that I would want to see, using the model I described before, where there's a charitable trust and a board, I would hope that the board had different perspectives on it as well. So that you had, for example, as you mentioned, someone who's connected to the local area, someone who had the indigenous perspective, someone who maybe knew about the legal side or, could bring different voices. And then that entity would get informed by all those perspectives to then, I assume it would be an actual person who would then go to the board meeting of the company and would then be charged with representing what it was that the board representing nature had said. So I think that's how I would approach it. Matthew, you've got a comment there. Go ahead. You welcome your comment.
Yeah, sure. Because with what we're doing, we're always constantly testing. So there in Whakatu, where we're doing the project, there are actually 8 iwi. And so um where we what we thought was that the iwi could actually nominate somebody to be the voice of nature. Then we found that there's actually a local trust that represents all iwi. Then we were found that we're actually two iwi that were particularly interested in the work in relation to the compliance on wastewater. And then they had different types of resourcing. One actually had an environmental services business. The other one had specifically roles that were kaitiaki in that rohi. And so the simple answer is that there is no fixed way of actually creating the right structure. It's the structure that works inside that rohi based on that tikanga, and then being in a position where you're of service to that rohi versus prescripting what you want as an outcome. So that relationship with the kaitiaki of the region is probably now 3 years deep, and so it's still a work in progress.
Mm, that's really helpful. And I think it illustrates the fact that there isn't just a template you can pull off the shelf and say, this is the only way. But to be honest, that's what excites me about this. I hope that you're getting a sense of my excitement because this is new. Nobody, as far as I can tell, nobody in the world has done this very well or attempted it even. So these are concepts and things that we can grapple with and we can explore and we can be part of something that I hope 100 years from now, someone might look back and watch this video, right? And say, look at what they were thinking about back then. Look at where we've gotten to now. So each of you on this call can be part of this. We can be part of developing a new way. And I think particularly here in Aotearoa, we have a very small population. We can move quickly. We can change things. So we could potentially be an example to other jurisdictions and other places around the world of how is it done? How could this be done? Look at the model they've used there. And that leads in nicely to Vicky's got a great comment. Thanks for the paper and talk. Does there have to be a totally different structure to business governance, which might be slow to embed, or could changes be made to the current legislation to require companies to make long-term decisions in balance with profitability? The short-term profit focus that undermines the natural environment isn't good for any business. Yeah, I agree with you, and that would be another angle to take, is could we tweak or amend the existing legal structures? For example, limited liability companies. As you probably know, but in case you don't, 2 years ago, Section 131 of the Companies Act was amended. That's the provision that says companies must act in the best interest directors must act in the best interests of the company, which traditionally has been interpreted through a Milton Friedman lens to say it's about the profits, how much can we make, even though the wording talks about the best interests of the company. Anyway, Section 1315 was added after Duncan Webb had his private members bill pulled out of the hat or the tin, I think it is. And that said, when making decisions about the best interests of the company, the directors can consider ESG type of decisions. So that's environment, society, governance. So that is actually currently in the legislation that when making decisions, directors can consider it. Um, Other jurisdictions have must consider rather than may consider. But the sad news for probably those of you on this call who are maybe more like the Lorax is that that section is due to be repealed. So it's going to be taken out and it will no longer be there. So I had a chat to the Law Commission recently who are looking into the issues around director duties, and I said this needs to be a discussion point. We need to reconsider this and look into adding something in about what directors need to consider when they're making decisions. But that's kind of the giving you the full background, the history. That's where it's up to. Um, I would actually love to see a new entity type called an impact company that sits between charity and for-profit company and potentially has some tax concessions. And the reason that you would get those tax concessions is that you state your mission and your purpose clearly in your constitution. That is not required right now. If you're a charity, you must state your purpose in your trust deed or your constitution, but companies do not require a constitution. You don't have to have one. So I'd like to see that introduced so that companies are required to have them. Yeah, so it's interesting era that we live in. And that's, again, what excites me is that we could actually do things differently in the future. We don't have to take the way things have been done as the only way. Um, yeah. All right. Looks like Alan's got a good comment here. No doubt, and I have thought about this. No doubt you've thought about multiple entities claiming to represent the same part of nature. One can imagine fishing companies trying this on. Yeah, and this is part of the issue is um, this new trust represents this lake. But that company over there says they represent the lake. And that other group over there says, like, how would this actually play out in reality? And I think you raise a good point, and I don't know the answer. I'm just trying to give you the ideas of the ways that it could be done or it can be done. Um, Brian, yeah, it's very case by case, no panaceas. Great explanation. Yep. All right. And yeah, yeah, Adrian's put in that the legal opinion commissioned by the Aotearoa Circle, i.e. common law, already requires what that section to be repealed requires. Yeah, so my view is that it would be helpful to state it clearly in the legislation. And I get the argument that, oh, well, we already think about nature when we're making decisions. But my fear is that that's amongst the companies who can afford to have lots of consultants and people involved in the decisions. And remember, I said there's 735,000 companies. I don't think all of those people are thinking about these sorts of things. So my view is that it's a helpful marker for people to think about when they are making decisions, acting in the best interest of the company. We also need to think about the impact on the environment or nature. So, yeah, cool. Great. Julie, you've got a thing there, a great idea, an impact company. How would this incorporate space? Are you meaning space like the planets or another type of space? Do you want to? You're welcome to come off of mute if you want, or type it in there. And as yeah, planets. Yeah, I don't know. This is the fun, right? We haven't really thought these things through as humanity or as a planet. What does it look like? I'm pretty sure what's going to happen is that somebody's going to claim Mars at some point, or, going to claim that asteroid that has all that valuable metal on it or whatever. So it's a really fascinating area to talk about. I also think large land masses might be interesting to explore. So the obvious one to me would be Antarctica. You think about Antarctica, it's not a nation. It doesn't exist. It doesn't have the bureaucracy of human beings. This is the president or the prime minister, but it has a lot of resources, and it's pretty important for the future of the planet that, the ice is there and the ecosystem, and think of all the krill and all that is involved in Antarctica. What would that look like to give it some form of legal personhood so it could enter into treaties with countries that have bases on its land? Um, I know this is conceptual and it's kind of almost sci-fi-ish, but I think we need to talk about it. I think we need to think about these things now. So that's the intent of doing so.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Because yeah, it's not only Antarctica, it's like the space market is just massive now, isn't it? So, and it's very important to iwi.
Yep. Yeah, totally.
So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for joining. Well, it's been great to have so many of you. I'm going to kind of move this towards the conclusion of the meeting. If you like the paper, would you please share it or tell someone else about it? Get some discussion going. It's a word of mouth type of thing. I don't have a massive budget to go out and try to get it seen. So I would really welcome anybody who is willing to share it or send it on to other groups. It's gotten into a few newsletters, which is really, really cool. Like the National Geographic for New Zealand, they put it in their weekender update. So yeah, I hope it can be a paper that's accessible. It's deliberately not too academic. I didn't put in footnotes. I just want it to be challenging people in their thinking about this. I'm willing to speak about it to boards or others if that's something that would help. And then maybe along those lines, if there's ways that you see that I can add value to groups that you're involved in, then I'm really happy to do that. I work as a lawyer, so I'm a partner at Perryfield Lawyers. We have about 100 people in our firm, and we have 5 different offices. So there might be legal things that some of you need help with at some point. So keep me in mind for those things as well. We do property, corporate commercial disputes, as well as this sort of future focus. What would it look like? How do we frame it? And then I also do the podcast seeds. So please, I'm sure your subscribers, it helps if you leave ratings and reviews. The algorithms like it for some reason. So if, find me in Spotify and leave a review or a rating. That really helps. And be watching because there's good content coming out all the time. That would be really helpful. And I also do another one called Board Matters for the IOD, which is all about governance. So that might be of help as well. So, oh, and there's heaps of free resources on our website. I've got how to be a good chair, how to set up a charity, how to run companies, how to hold AGMs, like heaps of free content. So make sure you check out the resources. But it's been great to have you all on the call. I'm going to close us with a little karakia. The English translation is, May peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all this day. Give love, receive love, let us show respect for each other. So thank you so much for joining, everybody. Kia ora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamu te moana, hai huarahi mā tato I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tato ia tato katoa. Thanks everybody for joining. I'll see you at some point somewhere, no doubt. Have a good rest of your day. And thank you, Matthew, for sharing. Bye.